Okay, well, this is gonna be a fun session, and this is talking about a very large survey we conducted last year to really start to quantify the impact of training, impact of general awareness of application security on developers, people that don't come to AppSec conferences. And this was in response to what Michael Coates and others have said for a long time, is we don't have numbers. And we'll talk about that and why that's really has been a challenge for all of us, both in the vendor community and on the enterprise side, consultants, you name it, dev managers. We consistently get asked this question, like what is the impact of? And, I'm going to go spend this money. Can you show me some? And then the bad words come out, return on investment. And there's really no great answer. So this is what spawned this. Okay, that's me, application security guy. I've been, I think, at every OWASP AppSec since 2005, whenever that was. One was in New York City, where we had roughly less people in the original OWASP AppSec USA than we have here today. So I've been doing this for a while. I've been a security guy for about 20 plus years, ex-Air Force guy. And I'm a dad right now, so my wife let me come to California. I'm not going to tell her how nice it is in California today. It's gorgeous. What's that? No checking in on Facebook, none of that stuff. No, none at all. It's supposed to be like 30 degrees in Texas today, as a matter of fact. So, yeah, because you know why? Because it's a Monday. It'll be 68 on Wednesday. Okay, and that's actually true. It was 72 on Sunday. It's going to be 22 tomorrow, and then it'll be 60 this weekend. So I run a company called Denim Group. We're about a 100-person company based in San Antonio, Texas. We focus on application security. Surprisingly enough, one thing is a little bit different than a lot of the folks in the space. We actually build secure code. We get asked by our clients to go and build secure software, which is surprisingly that happens, and it happens more frequently, lucky for us. But we come from this space, and we are a vendor that does e-learning and classroom training. So we get asked this question all the time. I've been asked, what is the impact? And then I do like the shuffle. I don't have a great answer. So talking to other vendors in this space, talking to buyers, this really kind of was the impetus of this particular presentation. Also, for those that follow Bruce Schneier, back in, I think, March of last year, he did a blog post, and it was ostensibly about security awareness training, but he came out and just said it was worthless, largely worthless, not worth the money, There's other things you can do. And then there was like a back and forth. Ira Winkler responded, other people responded, but I mean, it was out there. And it was a great point, because all of us have been through some type of awareness training, right? In companies you work with, or HR awareness training. The evil cousin of security awareness training is HR awareness training. And so we've all been through that. You get a little snippet, or the company meeting, and sometimes you retain it, sometimes you don't. So this was curious to all of us, right? This came out. So at the same time I'm getting these questions, this came out, and it spurred us. So, what, let's do a best effort to try to quantify this particular issue. And that is essentially the impact of security training on developers. But there's a real big difference. So right off the bat, we figured out a handful of things that were just shockingly different. Number one, well, first of all, they're saying that they're trying to change behaviors. One is change the way people act and click on things or not click on things, or that's one issue. And at the same time, there's huge differences. And probably the big one with developers, two or three big ones, is number one, they always have the capacity or the political power to say no to things. They always do. They can always use features and functionality and deadlines. Okay, we all know that, right? But the other thing that really jumped out at us is we knew some of this inherently, but the fact that it is much more disruptive. It just, an awareness training snippet is going to be by design a 10-minute little activity. Here's an email or an awareness deal, or, it's not disruptive. You do it in the course of your 8 to 10 hour day or whatever you work. Not so much for developer training. The average class that vendors teach is anywhere from 1 to 2 days, instructor-led training in a classroom. That is disruptive. Development managers are loath to pull people in chunks of 25 off the development line to go do developer training. And the same thing is true for e-learning. Most of the blocks of instruction for e-learning vary between 2 to 4 hours. Okay, they're smaller, but it's still 2 to 4 hours. It's not 15 minutes or 5 minutes. So across the development team, it's going to have a much bigger impact. So when you go as a security person and say, oh, we want to do some awareness training, it's probably backed up by compliance regulation, not a big deal, not a big ask. When you go and do this, this is a bigger ask. And the development managers view this as a project or something else I have to count for across the teams. That's an hourly hit of maybe hundreds or thousands of hours. So that's one big difference. But at the same time, training is like a feel-good thing that everyone does, right? And it's one of those sacred cows. I think Jeremiah, you talked about it in November in AppSec USA. It's something that managers are used to, buyers are used to, companies are used to, and PCI is used to. So it's part of the PCI DSS is thou shalt do secure training for developers, and you should measure that. So that is a discrete activity that managers, auditors, people understand and can quantify. That's why it's a thing that folks do. But there has been virtually no ability to quantify or no efforts to quantify whether or not that had a 1% impact on the security of code, a 10%, of all the different activities you can do that are prescriptive, that are good hygiene, what impact was it? That became painfully obvious in the background research that we did. So a little bit of background on the project. I'm going to jump ahead here. We started this, I want to say last spring, and then we brought on a full-time graduate assistant to help. And if we hadn't had her for 6 months, we wouldn't have got this done. I mean, quickly, I started to appreciate for the first time, maybe second time, Forrester, Gartner, the analyst firms and what they do, because this is a lot of work, right? I mean, to make it quantitatively interesting and not just an anecdote, it took a lot of work. So we started to do an exhaustive review of kind of training background and then also application security impact. And here's what we found. There's virtually nothing out there, of certainly nothing academic. We had professors, both CS professors and political science professors helping us because it was a survey, right? And so we go, and what we found out is in the enterprise, in most organizations, they don't quantify big HR training activities, period. There's a dearth of not just security or awareness or whatever. How about just activities? So there's, training in general. There's a large scale lack of information about development and training efforts. So, measurement is rarely found, period, for any training activity. So on top of it, there's just a lack of workforce analytics. And that is particularly pronounced the last 10 years with the workplace turnover, people running around. That is absolutely the case. So here's our imperative and here's our change, our charge to us in the industry. We had a interaction with one of our CISO clients probably about 2 years ago that still sticks in my head. We did, back when we started the company, a tabletop like lunch and learn thing for all the developers. And at the time, it was like 15 developers in this small company. And fast forward 5 years later, the CISO said, oh yeah, we brought Denim Group in and we did all this training. And I was like, that was 5 years ago. And every one of those folks that we trained are not at your company now. We know that. And as a grubby, self-interested contractor / vendor, whatever. But the point is that they did training way back when, and in their mind they thought, the guy kept thinking, oh, yeah, I did this. But the reality of it is that, there's two factors that are really exacerbating this problem. Number one is obviously the field's growing. Bureau of Labor Statistics says it's growing 30% in the next 10 years. We know that by anecdote. The reality of it is it's even crazier, right? It's growing across the board. You throw in mobile, throw in cloud, huge demand for developers, quantified, multiple sources. The other one that we found is very interesting, and the numbers bear this out, is that turnover within IT is obviously higher, and turnover within software teams is even higher than that. And we went out and found, a couple of good surveys, one by the Society of Human Resources that actually quantified that and interviewed 1,000 hiring managers, and they said, oh yeah, throughout industry, it's 14 to 15%. That's voluntary and non-voluntary turnover, I found out. You get fired. But in the software development area, much more voluntary and much higher, which means we're so the point here to take away is even if you do a bang up job in the spring of 2007, can't carry that forward for 6 or 7 years. It has to be something, and it has to be not one time, it has to be repeatable. So let's talk about the research itself. So first of all, one of our things that we tried to do, we thought about, and we just right off the bat said it was too hard to do, is we said, in a perfect world, we would test coders on code snippets, right? You'd say, hey, whether or not they could look at a code snippet and identify or build secure code, and then maybe have some training, and then afterwards they could either identify more vulnerabilities or write less vulnerable code, one of the two. Like software itself was the best measure, and ultimately it is the best measure. We all know that. The challenge is when you conduct a survey is you quickly realize logistically that's impossible. Not impossible, but incredibly intensive and resource intense to get, given the platforms and the different coding languages and you name it, very difficult. What we found out is getting people to fill out questionnaires over 6 months was also difficult. And we'll talk about that, the things you can learn from what we learned over the last 6 to 9 months. So we wanted to throw out a few things. We just wanted to assess general awareness, first of all. I mean, we're 10 years into this or whatever, 10 to 12 years into the whole focus of applications. So maybe this is more well-known, right? Maybe most developers, line developers know key concepts better than 10 years ago. So that was the purpose to measure the impact of training and also kind of a before and after. So we interviewed 600 folks. We'll go through how we did this and the specifics. We try to keep it as academically close to real as possible. And I'll kind of articulate where we deviated from that and some of our challenges that we had. And then we wanted to get as many verticals as we possibly could. So we looked at a bunch of folks, and about 600. The vast majority, if you look to the right, about 233 classified themselves as software developers. So we weren't going after security folks, we weren't going after auditors, people that classified themselves as software developers. And that's a self-identification issue right off the bat, right? So then we had a bunch of QA folks, architects, and we had 150 others. Well, that's hit us. It's like, okay, well, what we found out is 50 of them call themselves BAs or business analysts. So you could kind of put them in software somewhere or maybe in the QA or kind of like the junior level software folks, but they were involved with the software process. So that's right off the bat. We don't have security auditors or security folks in general. We looked at big companies, small companies. We tried to overcome regional bias. We're based in San Antonio, but that came up as an issue. We'll talk about that. And then one of the things we found is the vast majority of people we interviewed or surveyed, had over 7 years, and that just jumped out at me. So here's one thing that we learned in surveying is you can't throw out anecdote. Well, I heard this from a political science professor. If you have 2 anecdotes, then you have data. If you have 1 anecdote, that's nothing. 2 anecdotes, and now you have data. It's kind of a surveyor's joke, apparently. So one thing that was very interesting about this is yours truly had done a training class for a very large state government entity back in May. I went in, and I won't say which state or which entity, but about 60 developers. I was the youngest person in the room, and I'm 48. And that's not young, right? I was young, but I was the youngest person, and it shocked me. So the software developers in the public sector by far are much older, maybe double the age of software developers, and double the age, they are. So here's the other interesting, that's good or bad, I don't know if it is, it just is, right? The other thing that was a shocker is we're based in Texas. So what do we have an overrepresentation of? Energy and oil and gas firms. Guess how old those folks are? When I say, more senior. They're also much more senior than our company. Our average age of our developers is probably 24, 25. If you go to any startup anywhere, it's probably 24, 25. But, like in these big companies and big state agencies, it's more like 45 and up. So right off the bat, sample bias. So I'll just say that. There you go. And then the other thing we wanted to find out is, hey, had you had any training before, any application security training? So we broadly defined that. We found a lot of, a majority didn't, but a lot of people had. And what's shocking is about 95 had more than 3 days. Now, we're about 3/4 of the way through this survey. We realized, wow, we wish we had asked how long ago they had that training, right? It's another mistake. So, but that's something that's good to know, right? And we didn't ask whether or not they had done well on the training or whether or not they had passed the training. It was just whether or not they had a training. So that was a broad thing. So the other thing I would just mention, I'll repeat this, is with the lack of survey information, background research in the field at all, we quickly realized, wow, this is a solid survey, but it is really the start. I mean, like there's much more opportunity to dig deep into this data and to collect more data. Okay, so here's how we did it. So again, we couldn't do code snippets. That was too hard or logistically too difficult, or we have to have somebody interpreting, the answers and all that. So what we ended up doing is we took 15 questions that we felt were representative, that if you took these, you could either do two things: demonstrate that you knew awareness of application security concepts, or number two, you knew the prescriptive side. So I'll show you the examples of questions, but some were like, do you know what a cross-site scripting error is? And number two, do you know how to fix it? So some of the more prescriptive sides. We targeted software developers, I mentioned, although there was a lot of self-selection bias and people called themselves things. And I think if we had a chance to go back to the 150 others, we probably could have put those in one or the other camps. But we had software developers, architects, and then who are generally more senior by definition, and then QA people who largely were more junior. We're going to come back to that in a second. So we delivered it three ways. The first way we had hard copy, which is old school, but we did instructor-led training for three different classes. We had about 75 to 80 folks that went through these classes. We got to do, and Dan Cornell, who many of you guys know, did two of the classes. So you got to, throw them out there before, and then afterwards got them 2-day classes on AppSec security, on application security. So that was about 75, 80. The rest were mostly SurveyMonkey, and we tried to get companies that were right when they were doing application security initiatives or training, right? So we wanted to do it before and after. We wanted to, in order to capture that, you have to have some kind of, before state, training, and then after state. So that was a timing issue that was a challenge. And the last thing we did was social media. We put this out on Facebook and Twitter, and we threw some incentives out there. That got us a broader set of folks and overcame a little bit of the geographic bias. But as you'll see, I mean, like most professors will say, that's not Reuters. I'm not going to quit my day job and go work for Reuters or for one of the survey firms or anything like that. Okay, here are three big hypotheses. Number one, that most developers still don't have a basic concept. We felt that was the case, right, in a broad sense. And the second one was that, in fact, this training might have an impact, a positive impact by some number. We hoped. As a vendor that does this stuff, we sure as heck didn't want it to be the other way, right? There's a risk when we did this that it could, in fact, have a negative impact. And then we also thought that maybe there are certain industries like the financial, particularly financial, that might have a better head start. And the reason for that is because they're highly regulated, they're probably PCI, they're doing training, that maybe they had a better start. Okay, I talked about the sample questions. So we had two types. Here's two examples of the awareness, high-level awareness. And there's a couple that we looked at after we got the answers back that we also realized they were just not great questions. The one that was like, what's threat modeling? And I think 28% of the people got that right. So it's like, I went back and looked at the answers. The answers were pretty kind of ambiguous. So there's a few bad questions. Here's examples of the prescriptive stuff that and again, a difference of awareness of what the problem is versus how to fix it, right? So we had 15 questions, about 9 of them were awareness and 6 were prescriptive. Okay, so I'm going to jump into the results. Again, had a full-time graduate student working on this. We underestimated the amount of energy it took to capture this stuff. I'll just say that right off the front. Incredible amount of energy to reach out to individuals, companies, on Facebook. We were desperate because, ironically, I think I put in the title for this a long time ago. I was putting, hey, we have about 1,000 developers, and it was impossible to get it. I mean, I would have to quit my day job to do that. But we got enough, and we passed enough peer review on this that we felt pretty good about some of the results. And here's a handful of them. Okay, so we'll go through. This is probably the one that jumped out at us as a first starting point, and that is the QA folks consistently across the answers scored less well than their architects and software developer peers, if you could call them peers. This is interesting because for two reasons. A lot of organizations, including ours, put their junior developers into QA roles to get them started, right? So the average not age, but the average length of experience in the QA group is lower, right? But where does software security reside in certain organizations? In many organizations, it's in the QA branch. So this is a challenge right off the bat. This is something that we didn't expect. It wasn't in one of our hypotheses, but it did jump out at us throughout the process that the QA folks consistently under-tested versus everybody else. However, we rely on QA to have some material role in the application security process. So finding number one. Finding number two was this gap between the awareness and the prescriptive stuff. Now, across the board, they did pretty well, in some instances very well, about what a cross-site scripting error is. They knew the general awareness issues of application security, but almost to each question, they bombed the how to fix questions. That's an important point. So they're aware, they're more aware than what we thought, but their ability to fix. Now, if you go back to Michael Coates's question and remarks early in the morning about, hey, this needs to be either in the framework, and we need to make this in the library, there's still going to be some level of discretion that developers have. So the good news is that on the cross-site scripting is probably the example that is much more of a keyboard error or input error than a huge architectural problem. But this is something that jumped up at us very quickly. And when we do a subsequent version of this, we're going to drill down and even have more specific questions around this area. But that was the gap between knowing what it is and how to fix it was substantial. The other one is same. So people knew what input validation was. So they kind of knew some awareness about session ID. And here's the other big one. There was an impact. Let's talk about this for a second. That again, this is across all developers, all architects, all QA, is that it was about a 25% bump between the two. Now, let me talk about that for a second. We surveyed 600 folks. We ended up using 450 responses. We threw out 150. Why did we throw out 150? Because they didn't finish all of them. Call it sample fatigue, survey fatigue, whatever the heck you want to call it. In political scientists call it ballot fatigue. You vote for the president, and the senator, and then all the judges, and they don't care about that. You just, okay. So here's one of our projects that we're going to do this year, working on, is going and looking at all the different wrong answers or the incompletes. So one of the things that we've already identified is many of those wrong people that were incomplete filled out questions that are left questions that they didn't know the answer to. If you were to count those as all wrong, then this is even more dramatic. So that's one of the things that we were going to do is go look at that. So 150, that's a lot that didn't fill out one or two questions. They just didn't do it. So that's a big, out of the 600 that we surveyed, 450 that we used, the amount of folks that we were able to use the before and after was about 100. Again, and that was probably over 6 or 7 different verticals. It was solid, but it's still very lumpy and probably overrepresented by more senior folks. That's a nice way to put it. Looking back there, the older folks. So the point is that if we were to get anecdotally, I think the results would be much more dramatic. If we throw out some of our public sector folks are overrepresented, some of the energy guys are probably not on the bleeding edge of development, I think these numbers get better actually. And again, from a political science and a social science standpoint, you can't ignore anecdote. You can't ignore the fact that when you present to a public sector client and all of their developers are over 50, you got to remember that. You can't ignore that. And you have to analyze this through that lens. Okay, so there's some weird results that came through. Enterprises of more than 10,000 personnel had the lowest secure coding knowledge, and that again could be exacerbated by the public sector and the oil and gas guys that we looked at. I think if you were to even get it more finite to technology, we didn't, for example, break out technology companies. And I think we probably had less than 100 represented from technology companies. So if you get the numbers down in the tens, it doesn't mean that much. The majority of the respondents had no prior secure coding, which I don't know if that's surprising. It was surprising to us. You throw that through the issue of a lot of new entrants to the marketplace and to the development space, and that doesn't seem too scary. This is one that I feel the least comfortable with, and I might actually just totally throw out, and that is there's no correlation between years of experience and knowledge of secure coding. I think that's one of those ones where if you were able look at subsequent analysis that there's a story that is untold there. So here's another mistake we made. We did, I think, 1 to 2 years seniority, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and then over 7. Like that's a vast area. So we should do 7 to 10 and 10 to 15. And I think we can look at some of this stuff a little bit better. The response that had more than 3 days of AppSec training, we're able to answer more than half the questions correctly. If we added in a subsequent question of when you had that training, maybe this gets more interesting, right? So again, this was a massive effort of 1.5 folks over really 6 months. And the other thing you realize when the wheels are rolling and you're down halfway down the road, you can't like start to ask other questions, right? That's not great. Okay. 100% correctly identify where cross-site scripting executes after completing training. Okay, there's some of these are almost small, interesting or less interesting. Number of responses able to correctly identify was application security is okay. That's great. I mean, again, what I'm deeply interested in certain aspects of this, and even though it was my baby, deeply uncomfortable with some of the results that came back. Where like I said, if you throw out the no answers, if you go and look at recategorize the others as software developers, suddenly these numbers change a bit. Okay, so those are the direct things we learned out of this. We learned a bunch of things indirectly that I think that y'all can take back to where you're working and think about or put to work. Number one, that software developers learn differently than companies teach. Does that make sense? I mentioned earlier that teaching and instructor-led training and e-learning is a thing that people enjoy doing, and then they understand and are quantified. It's formalized. It's easy to checkbox. And if your PCI guys come in, and QSAs come in, they will look and ask you for the record of completeness and who completed it or whatever. It's easy to understand it, and it's easy to monitor. But what we learned throughout this process is that's not how software developers learn at all. Like aside from a 4-year degree, which many have, if not most, but not all. I mean, how many people went back to go learn Android? I went to Android school for 2 weeks, or went to, picked up iOS at iOS Academy for 3 weeks. I mean, like nobody does. You just learn it, right? You learn it through RSS feeds, through blog feeds. You learn it through just social media. You learn it. I mean, you learn it in bits and spurts. You learn it from peers. You don't learn it by stopping everything. So this difference between how AppSec training is delivered and how developers really learn, I think, is a shocking difference. And it also points to a little bit what Jeff Williams and I think Michael were saying earlier, and that is this issue of really where it's going to be fixed is in the software side and software development and in real time. The same is the case with training. I mean, if you do the way teach the way companies teach, you're not going to be effective. So how did I mentioned that? How do developers learn? They learn in an asynchronous way is a nice way to put it. So here's the other thing to realize is don't ignore the basics of training. I mean, what I mean by that is the way that I've heard it said by doubters of formalized training is that it's a tax on developers. You hear that term. It is a tax on development in developers. They have to go sit through it. Nobody learns anything. It's a drudge activity. That very well may be the case, but if you do any activity, it has to be interesting. You have to take current events. You have to do refreshers. So one of our things that we'd like to do afterwards is to look at the time between the test and the time that they took the training. We did capture the data for the 100 folks that did the before and after. We got their contact data. So that's the other challenge with doing this survey. 500 people didn't want to give us the contact data. Right? So we made that voluntary. We weren't going to force people to do that. And we got buy-in from employers. We got buy-in, but we said, hey, look, we're still going to do this kind of in a very soft way. If you're interested in the results. So we have the ability for at least 100 to go back and see 6 months from now how well they did. So the other thing is that if it's not relevant to people's performance plans, then they're going to ignore it. And the sophisticated organizations have made that it's such where hey, you have to do this and it's part of your MBOs or year-end bonus. And then the other thing is they do want an ROI. Managers always want ROIs. And that's hard to do. And so hopefully we have some starting the process of quantifying that so that you don't have nothing as an answer. Here's the other thing, human nature deal is incentives absolutely matter. So I mentioned that we did the classroom training, about 75 to 80 people, captive audience, not, imagine 3 groups about this size for 2 days. So you get to be friends and do things. We had 75 fill those out. We had, I think, 35 completed, 35 or 40 of those captive audiences. Almost half didn't finish the surveys. And I was stunned. It happened the first time. I was like, what the hell? We need all these responses. And the guys came back. It's like they came back and they all left and they didn't finish them. They didn't finish the second part. And it happened 3 times. So same held true with our Survey Monkey online. So we ended up doing the social media part where we actually threw Amazon cards and all these different things at it. Guess what happened after that? Everybody filled out everything. Yeah, not only did the responses went up, but we had virtually no half filled out ones after that. So our lesson learned from this to pass on to everybody is if you do anything, there has to be some kind of little tchotchke or something associated. And if you think you're above all that, then when you go next door to our vendor booth, don't pick anything up. That's all I ask. So we're to some degree we're human beings and we're Pavlov's dogs or salivate when we see Amazon cards. But the point is if you're rolling this out, the sheer absence of any incentives will actually hurt you, I think. What's that? It's like $50. Wow, rich. But the point is, I think that if you don't have these at all, and it's viewed as one more pain in the butt thing to do, then you don't be surprised by the results. So particularly if the developers don't report to you. So again, the conclusions, the main things they still don't understand the concepts. The majority of them failed, about 59%, but they did get better. They do understand these concepts 25% more. And the QA component, I think, was very interesting and bears further discussion. So where do we go from here after this? I think 2 or 3 things. Number one, we're going to do this again. The cycle was the summer and through the fall, probably about 6 months. If you're interested in this, I would say grab me because, one of the things we realized real quickly is it's hard to get responses. It's bloody hard to do that. And when you get the responses, don't be surprised when they don't get filled out all the time. So we were rolling into the fall, just with 200 or 300 or 400, and then it kind of fell into place towards the end. But there were weeks there where I was actually panicking because this was a major initiative for ourselves. I think the other thing is I would love stories of that take this from the anecdote to more of the quantitative. So if you have more references or other people that are doing cool things to quantify this is an area of future study. And with that, I'll wrap up.